Welcome to this session on emotionally based school avoidance. This session has been designed to support and guide both parents and school staff to help us to work together to get children back into school using the most effective methods that we have available to us. So let's talk about what we mean by the term emotionally based school avoidance. It's a term that's been used to describe children and young people who have a severe difficulty in attending school due to emotional factors, often resulting in prolonged absences from school. So those emotional factors, it's usually anxiety, but it can also be low mood or recovery from trauma, or perhaps bereavement that stops children from being able to attend school because of their emotions. It used to be referred to more commonly as school refusal, and sometimes school phobia. Personally, I don't like the term school refusal because it infers that there's some kind of choice that the child is making there to refuse to come to school. And actually, it's a really strong emotional pull that's stopping that child from being able to attend school. And I think that's a much better way of framing it and being able to then support it. So why does it happen? I think there are lots and lots of different reasons why this can happen, but this quote encapsulates it really well, I think. So this person, Thamjaraja, has said, school refusal occurs when stress exceeds support, when risks are greater than resilience, and when pull factors that promote school non-attendance overcome the push factors that encourage attendance. So really our aim needs to be to increase the support, to help to promote the resilience in that child, and to be able to increase those push factors that encourage them to attend and try to reduce their feelings of risk about school attendance. But obviously, in the context of COVID that we have at the moment, for lots of those children, the stress is really high, and for them the risks seem absolutely huge. So we really do have a battle on our hands, and it's very, very understandable why children would feel this way, but we do need to really support them in trying to increase those push factors to try and get them to feel safe enough to attend again. The research tells us that there are some risk factors that increase a child's likelihood of having emotionally based school avoidance. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I love this table that was put together by Tina Ray, Joe Wood, and Amy Such in their Wellbeing Toolkit for Mental Health Leads. And it separates into school factors, family factors, and child factors that increase the risk. So just to pick out a couple of these that I think are really, really important. Firstly, the number one factor, according to children, that increases their likelihood of school avoidance is bullying. So it's really important wherever you have a situation with a school avoidance to make sure that that's not a factor. Secondly, academic difficulties or academic pressure, particularly if that child has special educational needs. Exams, transitions are a huge thing. The research tells us that the ages at which there are peaks in emotionally based school avoidance are between the age of 5 to 7, where the child's just started school, again around the age of 11 when they're transitioning to secondary school, and then again at the age of kind of 14 plus, where they've got lots of life changes and big life events going on with exams and relationships and thinking about the future. Um, Going on to family factors, there are lots of things within families that things like separation and divorce, bereavement, parental, physical or mental health issues, conflict within the home, all things that we sometimes refer to as adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, and those always increase the vulnerability of that child. And then moving on to child factors, things like just differences in temperament. You do just get some children who are more sensitive and more prone to anxiety through their temperament. Experiencing trauma is a big one. Poor self-confidence. We've talked about age, and then learning difficulties as well. So children who are on the autistic spectrum are particularly vulnerable because of the environment within schools. Things like the heightened sensory issues within the school environment, the social demands, the lots of changes and lack of control can mean that for those children, those the risks and the stresses within school can be particularly high, and therefore the pull to kind of stay at home can lead to school avoidance. And I just want us to think a second about all of these risk factors in the context of COVID, because a lot of these risk factors have been increased by the lockdown situation. So, academic difficulties and academic pressure for those children who have been at home for 6 months. Some children will have done lots of work. Other children will have done less for a variety of reasons, and it may be that then coming back and feeling that pressure to catch up, and to feel that actually everybody else is ahead of them and they've missed out on so much, that could obviously increase the risk factor there. Transitions is it's one of the biggest transitions that most of our children will ever go through, really, having been out of school for such a long time and then going back into a school that looks very different, that feels very different, probably to a new teacher and a new class, and the school looking quite different in the way that it's set up. So it's a huge transition there after such a long time. Um, Peer and staff relationships. So again, for some children, they will have kept in touch with people, but for others, they've really become quite isolated, and they may have felt that they've lost some of those relationships, and lost those relationships with their teacher, not really ever had that kind of closure at the end of the year that they usually would have had. Transport and the journey to school might be completely different and look very different because they've got to wear their masks. Um, Bereavement and loss, for some people, they may have experienced that during lockdown. Parental health issues, especially with mental health. We know that the statistics show us that mental health issues have increased during lockdowns. There may be lots of parents who've really struggled with their own mental health, and then that may have impacted on the children. And conflicts and stress within the home. There's been lots of people have had financial difficulties during lockdown, and just the pressure of family all spending a lot more time together than they usually would have, can lead to a lot more stress. And finally, within the child factors, thinking about trauma. So a lot of research suggests that actually lots of children would have experienced trauma through all of this because they've lost so many opportunities and experiences, that they should have had. And then separation anxiety. So especially for the young children, but actually not just the young children, after being with their families for so long, and then having to come back to school, which they may find quite stressful, there may be issues with separation anxiety there after being with their families for such a long time. So just to talk a little bit about the psychological perspective on school avoidance, this is something that we call the cycle of school avoidance. And although school avoidance doesn't always start with anxiety, it is the most common culprit. So I think this is quite a useful framework to use to explore how we can support children. So it often starts with anxious feelings about school for a variety of reasons, whether that be bullying, academic pressure, COVID, and the risk of infection. It can be lots of different things. So anxious feelings about school, negative thoughts about school then develop, and their ability to cope. So anxiety often comes when you perceive the risk of something to be very high or the threat to be very high, and your ability to cope as being very low. You then avoid the situation that's evoking the anxiety. So often when we feel anxious about things, we avoid them, don't we? And that has then, if you look at the next box, immediately the anxiety reduces because you've avoided it, and then you feel better in the short term. But because you've done that, that avoidance is reinforced. It's positively reinforced because you've avoided it, it's gone away, you felt better, and then that increases the school avoidance. However, the problem with that is that the more that you avoid school and the more that avoidance behaviour becomes reinforced because it reduces that anxiety, the more likely you are to avoid and the more frightening school becomes. So if we have a look at that middle part, once you've started to avoid school, you end up falling behind in the schoolwork, which then leads to more anxiety, loss of friends and increased isolation, increased anxiety around school because it may have started with feeling that the academic demands and or maybe the loss of relationships, or that you'd had a fallout with a teacher or a friend. Those feelings are only going to increase by avoiding school. You then have the perhaps pleasurable activities at home. So it might not just be the fact that you've avoided, which feels quite nice. You've avoided the stress, which feels good, but then also at home, perhaps you're doing something that you quite enjoy. You might have to do a little bit of work, but then you can maybe sit and relax and watch TV, or do something else that they quite enjoy. Um, and then it leads to a decrease in motivation, and increase in anxiety about school. So it can really be a vicious cycle. And this is why we need to try and intervene as quickly as we possibly can, because the longer school avoidance continues, we know the harder it is to get children back into school. So we're going to take a look now at what we can do about this and the best way forward in helping to encourage children back into school. So just a few do's and don'ts to start us off. So as I said on the last slide, do try to start integrating the child back into school as soon as possible. However, do also take it step by step. So the last thing we want to do is what we refer to sometimes as flooding, which is where you put someone in a very stressful situation and just kind of see if they sink or swim, and hope that they swim. We definitely don't want to do that with children, because when you think about what it is that we want to achieve here, we want to increase their push factors that get them into school and reduce those pull factors. And actually, if we put them into a school where they then get confirmed, right, that yes, being in school is incredibly stressful and awful, then it's not going to increase those factors. It's not going to increase their feelings that they can cope. So we really want to take it step by step. It might be that you reduce their timetable to only coming in for maybe an hour a day at first, and then building it up once they feel safe enough. So really take it step by step, and we'll talk a little bit more later on about how we can do that. Do listen to the child, because often parents and staff can work really well together, but if we don't ask the children what they feel would help them and what it is specifically about school that is really, really stressful for them, then we're not going to be as effective as we could be. And often children will come up with things that might seem really, really trivial to us, but actually make a huge difference because it's about them feeling safe. So it's really important to talk to the child and really listen to them and take their views into account. Do work together. So again, we know from the research that where parents and staff work together to make a plan to get the child in, and everyone's working together, that's when you're most likely to have a good result. Do praise every achievement, no matter how small. It might be that the child has put on their school uniform in the morning and then maybe wasn't able to attend, but they've put their school uniform on. And for a child who's terrified of school, that's quite a huge step anyway. So try to praise every little achievement, no matter how small it feels. And the next one, do try to just treat every day as a new day, even when it's gone really wrong, perhaps the day before. Have hope and positivity for the next day and wipe that slate clean. And this is really much easier said than done, because as well as school avoidance being an incredibly stressful thing for the child, it puts a huge amount of strain and stress on any family, and it can be incredibly frustrating for any family. So just try to make sure that you're looking after yourselves and looking after your own stress, and doing what you need to, so the self-care that you need to be able to look after yourself, so that you can start afresh every day without the child feeling your stress and your frustration, which is only going to make things worse for them ultimately. Don't push them to try too much too soon, we've talked about. And finally, do increase what we call protective factors. So we talked a little while ago about risk factors. And when we're thinking about whether a child is going to be able to respond in a resilient way when they're faced with adversity, it's really looking at kind of a balance between those risk factors and their protective factors. So if we can increase the protective factors, then that's going to really help children to be able to respond to situations in a resilient way. So when we talk about protective factors, this grid from Young Minds, it's called the Interactive Resilience Framework. This is brilliant because it shows you all of the factors that the evidence shows us increases the chances that a child is going to be able to respond in a resilient way. So it's really worth looking at these and thinking about your child, or thinking about the child that you're working with, and thinking about which of these you might be able to support to help them to have lots more protective factors to try and outweigh those risks. So these are put into kind of 5 different categories. So you've got the basics of them having a healthy diet, having enough sleep. Sleep is so crucial in emotional regulation. Having lots of time to be able to play and enjoy themselves, and having kind of a stress-free environment in their home environment. You then got belonging. So do they feel that they belong? Chances are, if they're at home, they're probably feeling a decreasing sense of belonging. So what can you do within school to help them to feel that they still belong there? learning. So helping them to think about what it is that they want, and highlighting their achievements, especially if they are a child who's really starting to not want to come to school because they're feeling that they're really getting behind with their work and they're going to be behind everybody else. Coping, so helping to foster their interests, teaching them strategies to calm down and self-soothe, which we'll talk about in a moment, and instilling a sense of hope in them. So keeping that optimism, even when that's so difficult for you because you're frustrated, but keeping that sense of hope and optimism that tomorrow's a new day and tomorrow we might be able to get you in and help things to feel a bit better. And I think at the moment it's really important more than ever to reflect upon a couple of things when we're thinking about how we support the children. And I think it's really important to reflect for both parents and school staff, to think, how do I feel about school? Do I feel that it's a safe place? Do I feel that we should be there? Um, because children are really good at picking up on how you feel, even when it's not something you've explicitly said to them. So it's really important to reflect on how you feel and the messages that they may possibly be picking up from you, and the anxiety that you have. And also, it's worth saying that it's not always that children are worried about something at school and that's the reason that they don't want to go. Sometimes it's that they're worried about something at home and they want to stay at home to protect parents, and that might be the pull factor that's keeping them away. So it's really worth, again, when you are working together, with parents and teachers, or parents and school staff, just all taking the time to reflect together about the messages that you're giving the child about school. Are you giving them really positive messages? And is that how you feel? Is that what they could be picking up from you? And if not, thinking about how that could be adjusted. So, if you think that anxiety is the root of the issue with the school avoidance, then these are some tips for tackling the anxiety. So, first thing, listen, empathise, and validate. It's so tempting as parents and school staff to just want to try and take the worry away. And we use phrases like, don't worry, you'll be fine. And actually, I don't think anyone has ever not worried when someone's just said, don't worry. It sort of doesn't really do anything. So it's much more powerful to listen to the child firstly. What is it that they're really worried about? Empathise with them. I would feel worried too if I felt that was a risk. And validate. Lots of other people feel that way. You're not on your own. It's totally understandable that you would feel that way. Try to identify their underlying thoughts. So if you have a look on the right of the screen, this is the thoughts, feelings, and behaviours triangle. And this is really the crux of cognitive behavioural therapy, which is one of the most effective tools that we can use for children and adults with anxiety. And really, the idea of this is that when you have anxiety, it all starts with a thought. So what you think. So it might be for a child that they're thinking, if I go to school, I will catch the virus, bring it home to my family, and we'll all be very ill. So that might be the thought they're having. Obviously, if you had that thought and you thought that was definitely going to happen, how would you feel? You'd feel very unsafe at school. You'd feel very anxious about attending school. Um, and then what do you do? What's the behaviour? You then avoid it. And then by avoiding it, you stay safe. So that then just reaffirms that thought. School is dangerous, home is safe, and then it carries on in a vicious cycle. So it's really important to identify those underlying thoughts, because sometimes we might have a rough idea of what the area is that they're worried about, but um, it might not always be the things that we think that they're concerned about. And often the thoughts aren't quite, whilst they're understandable, they're not quite rational. And they often do what we call catastrophizing, which is thinking of the worst possible thing to happen, and assuming that that will happen. So something like, I will go to school, I'll catch the virus and I'll die, would be an example of catastrophizing, because it's thinking about the worst possible scenario as being likely. Teaching calming strategies. So calming strategies could be things like breathing exercises. So you might try sort of breathing in for 7, and then breathing out through your mouth for 11 seconds. And in doing that a few times with them, it will really help to slow that breathing down. And by slowing your breathing down, that then can stop that fight or flight anxious response in its tracks. You might also want to try some mindfulness, and there are some brilliant apps which obviously are quite engaging for children. So the Calm app is a brilliant one. Headspace is really nice. It's got lots of animations that are quite child friendly, and there's one called Onvana as well. So lots of apps that you can get for mindfulness, or there are just lots of activities. If you have a look on a website called Elsa Support, they have lots of activities and little worksheets you can do. There's lots of more mindful colouring that you can try, and they're all lots of, not all of them are free, but lots of them are free where you can download them. Scaling. So scaling is just thinking about, in different situations, just ranking from kind of 0 to 10 how they would feel in different situations and how anxious they might feel. And by doing that, thinking about, right, how anxious do you feel at home? How anxious do you feel at drop off? How anxious do you feel at break time? How anxious do you feel during lessons, etc., etc. And by doing that, you can then use that to then build what we call an anxiety ladder, which I'll show you in a moment a picture of. But it's basically where you rank situations from the least stressful thing that they feel that they can maybe cope with, right up to the most stressful thing that they can think of, and helping them to gradually climb that ladder whilst practicing their calming strategies until they become comfortable with each step. And that's the way that, as I said before, it's so important to go step by step, and that can really help you to do that very, very effectively. The next thing is a Sunday evening and Monday morning plan, because often you might find that children find it much more difficult after the holidays or even after a weekend, and that then they're much more anxious on a Monday than they perhaps would be on a Friday. So a Sunday evening and Monday morning plan can be really effective, and I'll show you a really good one in a moment. And then finally, emotion coaching, which is essentially what I talked about in the first one. So listening, empathizing, validating, labeling the emotion that they're feeling, and helping to kind of problem solve together once you've done that. And I will be making another webinar on emotion coaching if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Language is a really important thing here. And as I said before, there are certain phrases that we use a lot as adults with children where we just really want to take that worry away. So we dismiss it. And actually, it doesn't feel good when someone dismisses things that you're worried about. It doesn't make you feel any better about it. It just makes you feel that you've not been understood. And so really we need to avoid phrases like, don't worry, it's not a big deal, stop thinking about it, I'll do it for you, and there's nothing to be afraid of, because all of those are very dismissing. And what would be much better to try instead would be phrases like, let's talk about it and make a plan. I can see that this is really hard for you. Let's try such and such. I'm wondering if you're feeling worried about. And sometimes that's a good one, because often, especially with young children, they really lack the emotional vocabulary to be able to tell you when they're worried about something, and they might be experiencing worry for the first time, and actually that tummy ache that they've got, or their heart beating really fast, or feeling a little bit dizzy and wobbly, they might not call that worry. They might not know that that's anxiety. So it's really important to try and identify how they're feeling and give them a label for it, so that they can start to use that in the future and express how they're feeling to you. What do you think we could do that would help? Because again, they often have really good ideas. And I'm sure we've all had that experience where we've told someone something that we're upset or worried about, and they've tried to solve our problem for us. And again, it's not great. It doesn't particularly help, and it does just make you feel really disempowered and not heard. So asking them what they feel would help them. What can I do to help you, do you think? Or what can we do together that's going to help you, is really empowering. And that's what we want. We want them to feel that they can cope, not that they need others always to help them cope, but that they can cope. And would you like to try? That will help you when you have those anxious feelings. So would you like to try some of this breathing, or do you want to try some mindful colouring? Do you want to try maybe distracting ourselves and counting all of the red things that we can see, or all of the square things that we can see? all of those things are going to really help them, because A, you're helping them to reduce their anxiety, and you're teaching them those tools that they can use in future. This is another really useful tool. It's called the Incredible 5-point scale. So we talked a little bit before about scaling. And another way that you can do scaling is by using something like this, where you start to introduce levels of intensity of emotion, and help children to kind of be able to start to identify those internal feelings that they're having, and give them a label. So it might be really what you want children to be able to do is identify when they're maybe getting to a number 3, rather than it waiting until they're at a 5 and they're super anxious and they're completely panicking and overwhelmed. We want them to start to notice those little feelings that they start to have when they're around a number 3, and having tools to be able to then bring it back to a 2 or a 1. So it might be that for each of these, you might like to get your child to kind of draw a face of how they feel when they're at a 4 or at a 5, and give that a label, because for us, we might call that anxiety. For them, they might call it something completely different. And it's really good to use their language, because that's what it means to them. So get them to give it a name, and then think together about, right, when you are at a number 4, this is what we're going to do to try and bring you back down to a number 3. And it might be using the breathing technique, or doing some mindfulness, or doing some visualization, or maybe if they get really worried at night time, something like progressive muscle relaxation. If you Google that, that's a really good thing to do, where they start at their feet, and tense their feet, and then tense their calves, and work their way all the way up their body, and then do the same coming all the way down. And it gets their body to relax, but it also distracts them, and it also gets them to focus on the present moment, because that's the power of mindfulness, really, is that it's getting them to focus on the present rather than thinking about the past or the future, because most of our worries tend to be about things that have happened, or things that might happen in the future. So often worries will usually start with the phrase "what if," and that's usually where our fear comes from. So mindfulness and getting to stay in the present moment is very, very powerful. This one is the anxiety ladder, which I referred to before, and this is how you can help to go step by step. So by getting them to talk about all of the different scenarios that you have, maybe you might talk about putting your uniform on. What kind of number of anxiety rating would you give that? So it might be that they give it a rating using those ratings that you use on your incredible 5-point scale, or it might be, if they're older children, that they can do the percentage as shown on this particular sheet. But just ranking different situations and thinking about what is actually maybe doable at the minute, what could you just about cope with, and what would be way beyond things that you can cope with. Make yourself a hierarchy here, with the most stressful situation being at the top and the least stressful being at the bottom, and gradually work your way through. And it's really good to kind of make sure that you celebrate all of those small steps of achievement on the way up, and reward those in some way, something that so that the child can start to really celebrate and build their confidence, and their confidence in their ability to cope. So earlier on, I mentioned this, which is the Sunday evening plan and a Monday morning plan, because this is often a bit of a trigger point. And these are lovely, these sheets. These have been made by Dr. Tina Ray, who's an educational psychologist. She's used the acronym Sunday and Monday on both of these to try and make them a bit easier to remember. And really, it just encapsulates all of those different strategies that we've talked about the way that you talk to children, and some of the activities that you might do with them, the calming, soothing kind of activities, challenging their thoughts. It's all here for you, all in one sheet of paper that you can just have a quick look at. So the Sunday evening plan, it has things in there like the soothing, so doing things that are nice and calm, and talking about good things before bed to try and put them in a positive frame of mind rather than thinking about their worries. Understands, that's all about the kind of wording that you use. Neutralize, so talking about worries and recording them in a worry book so that you can then put them to one side, because there's nothing worse than going to bed with all the worries floating around in your head. Making a plan, so getting your all of your stuff ready for school, your PE kit, your materials that you might use, so that there's not that mad panic in the morning. Because really, that Monday morning, you want to keep it as settled and as calm as you possibly can. Um, Attend, so be vigilant to the child's emotional state. Try and again use that emotional coaching of trying to label it for them. If you can see that they're starting to feel a certain way, labeling that for them, using your empathy and validating, and starting to problem solve. And then yourself. So I love these because they really do always keep bringing it back to trying to keep yourself calm, because if you're panicking, and you're worried and you're frustrated, it's only going to make things 10 times worse for the child. So these very much focus on that as well. And then you've got the Monday morning plan, which is lots of the same kind of things. So again, she says first things first, make sure you're calm, and give yourself a bit of extra time in the morning to make sure that it doesn't become really rushed. And chaotic, because that's never a good start. Get organised, uh, neutralise. So again, talk to them if you can see that there's any catastrophizing going on or irrational thinking. Try to have time to sit with them and talk through that. Start to make a plan about exactly how things are going to look, because if children start to, if things become, feel that they're within their control and they're predictable, that will reduce the amount of stress that they feel. So things like, she's made some nice suggestions here about in the car, stories that you might want to tell each other, or music that you're going to listen to on the way there, just so that everything, they can visualize everything and it feels very familiar and safe. Accept the child's emotional state, and use all of that validation that we've talked about before. And again, she said, coming back to yourself again at the end and looking after yourself and making sure that you're regulated, and just keeping in the mind the script. If I stay calm, I will make him or her feel safe. So I just want to talk for a little moment about separation anxiety, because for a lot of children, especially the younger ones, it's the separation anxiety that's the emotion that's then leading to that school avoidance. And so that tends to be the hardest bit of their day. And if we can just get them in, and then the rest of the day they will feel okay. So I just want to talk about a couple of lovely tools that there are, to help you with separation anxiety. Because what we find with the older children is that it's less around separation anxiety and more around the social anxiety that they might feel at school, or anxiety about specific things within the environment. So I'm just going to take you through a few tools for separation anxiety. Firstly, the first one is a nice one called the hug button, which is the idea that you draw a little heart on their hand and a heart on your hand. You hold hands all the way to school, to power up the hug button. And then once they're at school, if they feel that they're missing you, they can press the hug button to get a hug from you, or to be able to give you a cuddle. And it's just a really nice way of them being able to still feel connected even though you're apart. So that's one. The one issue with that at the moment is, that children are having to wash their hands so much that it could quite easily be the case that the hug button could get washed off, and then that lead to further distress. So what some parents are doing instead is just rolling up the sleeve, and just on the inside of the cuff, just sewing in a small cross, an X as a kiss, that then the child can use as a hug button instead, and that's always there, but nobody else would ever be able to see it. Second one, the little girl holding the bear, is to represent what we call a transitional object, which is an object that they bring in from home, just a really small thing, preferably not a huge toy, and especially cuddly toys at the moment may not be allowed in schools. So you need to check with your individual schools about what you're allowed to bring in. But having an object from home that they take in, that just again helps them to feel connected with home and helps them to remember that they will be coming back home at the end of the day. So it just helps with that transition. And then the third one is an absolutely gorgeous book called The Invisible String by Patrice Cast, which is all about the idea that all of us, if you love somebody, you're connected to them by an invisible string that comes from your heart to their heart, and that the whole world is connected by all of these invisible strings. And that if you're ever missing somebody, all you need to do is just tug on the string, and then they'll be able to feel a tug on their heart, and they can do the same vice versa. And it's just a really lovely book. You can buy the book. You can also buy workbooks that have nice activities in them that are related to this, and calming activities as well. Or if you didn't want to buy it, there are lots of videos on YouTube of people reading the story. So you can always tap into one of those if you want to. So I just want to talk specifically about children on the autistic spectrum just for a moment, because whilst lots of those other strategies that we've talked about before will all be very useful for children on the autistic spectrum, there are also some additional considerations to think about that are more specific. Also, I think whilst transitions are always difficult for all children, actually, they can be particularly difficult for children on the autistic spectrum. And at the moment, I think we have a very unique situation where all of the children have been at home for so long, um, and now they're coming back. And for a lot of children on the autistic spectrum, actually being at home will have been quite lovely because they've been away from those social situations that they can find really difficult and stressful. Um, they've been away from the sensory overload that is a primary school or a secondary school, where there are just so many people and so many smells and so many noises, and it's all very noisy and busy. And so coming back into that can be very, very stressful. So there are some other considerations that are just worth thinking about for those children. Firstly, they need consistency and structure more than anybody else. So having that Sunday night plan and the Monday morning plan, and also preferably knowing in advance what their days are going to look like, perhaps starting every day in the same way if you can, would probably be really helpful. And again, doing that in a plan with the child so that they can tell you the things that bother them and the things that they would really like if they've got the language to be able to do so. Support at unstructured times, so play times and lunch times can be particularly tricky, and often schools have lunchtime clubs and things that children can go to where it is more structured. However, the time that often gets forgotten and the time that can lead to lots of stress is that before school, where they've been dropped off, but school hasn't quite started yet, and they're maybe out in the playground before going into their classrooms, and that can be a really tricky time. So if you can make sure that that drop off is really structured, maybe somebody meets them and takes them into the classroom and does an activity with them, a nice calming activity before the day even begins, that would be a much better way to start. Having pre-warnings of any changes and trying to keep things as consistent as you can. Um, and especially where the classrooms look so different and there might be lots of changes to the usual routine, trying to let them know that in advance wherever you can. Being aware of sensory sensitivity. So as I said before, they may have been used to, while they've been at home, they've been away from that, and in school there is just a huge amount of sensory information everywhere. So being aware of that, and making provision for them to have somewhere quiet and calm to go to if they need it. Try and increase their feelings of control wherever you can by using things like the first and then boards or the now and next boards, or giving them choices wherever possible. Because if you feel in control, that's likely to ease your stress and help you to feel that you can kind of face stressful situations a bit more easily. Support their social interactions, as that can be a huge source of stress. And then just where you can, minimise transitions throughout the day. And that's it from me. But there are just a few resources that I wanted to point you in the direction of. One of them is Salford County Council. They've put together some lovely resources. There's booklets for young children about school avoidance and about going into school. There are booklets for parents. There are booklets for older children as well. So that's a really good place to look, and I've put the link there for you, but you can quite easily find them if you just search for the Salford County Council and emotional based school avoidance. And the same with West Sussex County Council. Again, they have some lovely resources as well. So they're well worth a look. And those Sunday morning, Sunday night and Monday morning plans have been sent out to your schools. So if you want copies of those, you can access them there. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope it's been helpful.